Hi, everybody, and welcome. We are so glad to see you today. We are Scott, Rachel, and Judith from Fortuna Admissions. Delighted to spend some time with you this morning and delighted to have the opportunity to chat with you about the Graduate School of Business at Stanford. We know you have a lot of questions, and we know that there are going to be a lot of things on your mind regarding applying and those pesky essays that we're sure you are spending a lot of time imagining and refining. And with over between the three of us, I'm going to go with close to 75 years of experience in admissions. Not to date anybody, you guys, but I think we feel pretty comfortable and confident to share with you our backgrounds and our insights into the program and how to best address that GSB essay prompt. Just by way of introduction, my name is Judith Hodara. I'm a founder and principal at Fortuna Admissions. We're a boutique admissions consultancy that was founded about 11 years ago. And we're really excited to have with us today Rachel Erickson, who is one of our senior expert coaches. And she is involved primarily with students that are applying to the top M7 schools around the world, including the Stanford GSB. And also really glad to have Scott Brownlee with us. Scott is also an expert with us and has vast experience in working with students to help them refine their essays and really achieve their MBA dreams. Before we dive into today's conversation, I did want to encourage you to, once you see the video, to go ahead and like that and react to it. We are also excited to encourage you to give us some questions and comments and concerns in the chat section or the comment section. We're very looking forward to reacting to them and to getting you started on anything that's on your mind in particular. So with the MBA application season in full swing, my colleagues are hard at work helping students to really dive down into their essay presentations and their essay foundations. And before we start the presentation, I thought, Rachel, can you just talk a little bit how it is that you work with your students as they go through this process while we're waiting for the presentation to load?
Sure. It's very much an iterative process. It often starts with some brainstorming phone calls where we're talking through possible ideas. Sometimes my clients already have something written that they want me to react to. And it's really finding a story and a theme that works and that captures who that person is. And then there's a lot of back and forth, sometimes more brainstorming, and then also a lot of written comments, trying to refine that story, make everything clear, make every part of the essay really meaningful, relevant, and trying to capture who the person is.
And Scott, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit about how you're working with your students right now?
Yeah, we're working particularly on the writing from the heart aspect of the Stanford essay. That's hard for folks, I think, that have been in business roles for a couple years, maybe outside of that academic setting when they were writing essays. And so we're spending a lot of time kind of going back in their life and looking at some of those key moments that have shaped them, maybe before they started work. And I think that's actually fun, and they end up enjoying that.
Great. Well, again, really excited to have you guys with us. And don't forget, when you join as a viewer, please let us know where you're joining us from and how you're doing on your GSB application. We want to make sure that we can answer any specific questions that you have. So believe it or not, I'm going to play the moderator role today, which is a little unusual for me. I'm usually in the hot seat. And again, going to turn this over to Rachel and Scott, who are going to be talking about how to tackle the Stanford GSB essays. Again, a little bit about us and our backgrounds. Fortuna has about a coaching team of about 45 of us from around the world working with students on the M7 and beyond. So really a wonderful group of individuals that are dedicated to helping you achieve success in your MBA application process. We're going to go ahead, Scott, and jump into the essays themselves. And sort of talk a little bit about what it is that students may be thinking about as they get started in thinking about their background. We're going to go to the next slide. Really, basically, this is what we're going to be covering today. What are those essays? I'm guessing that most of you know how to craft a winning essay. What are some things that you might want to avoid? We have the benefit of essay samples with us, which is amazing. I love being able to work with actual live essays. They're not live for this year, but they're essays that have been written in the past, and give you guys a chance to see how we would work with students that we're submitting them. And then, of course, to take your questions. So moving along, we're going to jump right in. And we are going to start with, what are the essays and what are they looking for? So moving things over to Rachel. Rachel, if you don't mind, kind of diving in, and if you could
Sure.
tell us a little bit about these essays and how you would generally approach them.
Yes. So the first Stanford essay question is, what matters most to you and why? It's a pretty iconic question at this point, and they really tell you what they want. They want you to reflect deeply and write from the heart, as Scott said. They're looking for something meaningful and personal. And then the other thing to keep in mind is it's not about what matters most to you as much as it is about the why. And that's the part of the essay that we spend a lot of time working with our clients to make sure is completely clear. Scott, you want to talk about the second essay?
Sure, you can take a deep breath with essay 2. It's a little more straightforward. Still difficult. Stanford offers a lot of different opportunities, but on this one, describing your aspirations and how your Stanford GSB experience will help you realize them. I think a lot of times folks will jump right into how Stanford can help them, but not spend enough time on the aspirations, and we'll dive into that. But it's kind of that balance of letting the committee know a little bit about what those aspirations actually are, maybe beyond just the next job you want to get, and then doing some deep dive research into how Stanford can help you reach those aspirations.
Great. So we're going to go ahead to the next essay, to the next slide, and talk about that first essay. So Rachel, back to you.
So the first rule of business school essays is show, don't tell. You want to approach these stories, these essays through stories and not analysis. So don't say something like, I'm deeply committed to helping my community thrive. Instead, share a story that makes it clear what you have done from your community, and then you won't even need that sentence. You want to think about stories in your life that capture who you are, what's important to you, what shows you making mistakes or learning, what shows you at your best, what has made you the person you are today. And it doesn't have to be something earth-changing. It just has to represent who you are. And then any analysis that you do should come after you've told the story, when you're reflecting on its importance to you. The second thing to keep in mind is that the point of this essay is to get the reader on the admissions committee to think like, wow, I want to meet that person. And realize that there are a million different ways to do this. You can have an incredible backstory that shows the challenges you've overcome. You can have a really fun essay that shows that you're just going to be a great person to have in the class. You can have an incredibly thoughtful, insightful essay about a topic that's important to you, or you could have an essay that shows your passion and commitment to a cause. These are just a couple of the ways that you can help the reader understand who you are and get to know you as a person. I also want to make it clear that it is completely fine to show that you're not perfect, that you're still learning, you're still growing. You don't have to have everything have a happy ending. You can still be a work in progress. In fact, they're looking for that. The third point I would say, and this is really important, is to be personal, honest, and specific. One thing I tell my clients is that when you're writing this essay, do not think about what is going to impress the admissions committee. That is absolutely the wrong way to go about it. Instead, think about writing to yourself 20 years from now, and think about what you would want to read about who you are, your hopes, your dreams, your fears, your personality, what you've been through. And that's sort of the way to think about that, capturing that personal element. I'm going to say that if you're writing something because you think it sounds good, or it's what the admissions committee wants to hear, like talking about changing millions of lives, or, helping to, sort of bring the community together, it's going to come across as a cliche, and cliches are really easy. Where it gets interesting is if you're authentic and you're real about really what matters to you and why. One of the best ways to find this authenticity is to be very clear and specific about what you write. So anyone can say this experience was extremely challenging, but only you can write about why it was challenging, what it was that you went through, and what it meant to you. And that's how your essay becomes unique and authentic. I'm also just going to give a warning that if I read an essay and something strikes me as not quite right, I often find when I probe deeper that the applicant has kind of skipped over some details or changed the story slightly because I think it's going to make everything fit better. And please don't do this because it trips my applicants up so much of the time. It is much, much, much better to just think about being completely rigorously honest and accurate and capturing whatever the nuance is of the situation. And then you don't have to worry about coming across as fake or insincere. And then my last point for something that you need to do, and this is actually something that is in keeping with analytical writing that you did in high school and college, is that you need to provide evidence to support your arguments. But instead of the evidence being a line from a text, they're stories from your life. And that is how you make the essay seem real. I want to make it clear, though, that you need to make sure your evidence supports the argument that you're making. So, for example, if you have a sentence, I loved encouraging others and challenging them to reach your limits. And then you write a story about encouraging some kids to learn how to swim. That's not challenging somebody to reach their limits. That's a very specific statement you've made. And you need to tell a story that actually shows that. That's what I mean about making sure that the examples you give match your arguments. Scott, do you have any points that you want to add on that, or should we jump to the example?
Just that, Rachel, I love how you frame this, particularly that writing to a future you. And I think vulnerability is the one thing I would add to this. Vulnerability is memorable, and when the application committee is reading hundreds of essays at a clip, vulnerability and memorability are important, right? So that honesty is really critical. So I just love that you reinforce that for them.
Okay, so now we have someone who has very graciously, if we just move to the next slide, graciously agreed to share a sample. This is an excerpt from a real essay that somebody wrote. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that this writer did very well. This essay is about somebody who's, what matters most to them is dedicating their lives to others. And one of the things that they did well is that they made it believable because they gave an example in the second paragraph that really shows this. It's someone who discovers that their neighbor's child cannot read. And in order to address this problem, they resigned from their job. They used their savings to start a company, and with no business or tech background, while still in college with a year to go through, they teach themselves coding and take over 100 online courses. That is commitment. That is someone who has promised that they are somebody who really cares about others and then delivered with their example. They also kept it as a very personal story. They kept it also tightly focused on a couple of key points. The author in the first paragraph talks about their mother and growing up in poverty, but how their mother still found joy in life and in helping others. And then in the second paragraph, the writer comes to how they have come to this later in life. So there's not too much that they're trying to cover in this essay. They've really kept it focused on one key theme. And then finally, something else that I love that this writer did is that they used some really vivid, clear examples showing what the hardships are that the writer went through. This one line that their mother, fled the civil war in Burundi, forgoing her dream of medical school weeks before matriculation. That one phrase, forgoing medical school weeks before matriculation, captures an incredible sacrifice. The reader doesn't need to say, or the writer doesn't need to say anything more. Anybody reading that understands what that mother went through and what that mother gave up. And those are some really effective ways to get a lot across in the limited word count that you have. Scott, what about you? Do you have any thoughts on this essay?
Yeah, Rachel, the other thing that I would add, I really like that this essay starts with spoken language, because I think as humans, we like to kind of use movies as our referent, and it's like someone saying something actually draws us in and makes us pay attention more oftentimes than kind of a general essay voice talking to us. So I thought that was a really effective way to kind of create some pathos with the reader, which is great.
I totally agree. That's a great point.
Great. So now we're going to go to if we can, we'd like to go to the next slide and see what it is that maybe could have been different about this particular essay.
So first, I'm going to talk about some general don'ts, and then we'll go back and look at that essay.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
So a couple of general pieces of advice. The first is don't try to fit too much in your essay, and the author did a really good job of not doing that here. You do not need to share your entire life story. You should think about the couple of things that the admissions committee that you really most want them to know about you and who you are, and focus on that. And telling one story compellingly is much better than trying to fit too much in. The next thing I would say is that you should stay away from essays that are about universal experiences or things that happened to you. And let me explain what I mean by that a little more clearly. Sometimes it's tempting to write an essay and it's about you're the new kid at school and you had to stand in front of the class and be introduced. You didn't have anybody to sit with in lunch. You had to make new friends. You didn't know anybody. It was a completely new environment. Those are all things that happen to you. And those are all things that are what I would describe as a universal experience, meaning one that is not specific to you, but is a kind of a general experience that anybody in that situation is going to go through. And you can use those and include those, but those work as setup. And those work as the very beginning of the essay. Like you saw in this past essay, the author did a really good job of using those as setup, where the author talked about the experience of, of their mother experiencing poverty and what they went through. But it wasn't the whole essay. It was just the beginning. And then the important thing in those essays is to pivot. You're the new kid at school. What did you do next? How did you make friends? How did you fit into the classroom? What did you do? How did you react? That's what the business schools care about. So you need to make sure that you keep the essay focused on what you have done and who you became as a result of your experiences. You also want to avoid the dreaded resume to prose, which is where you talk about your accomplishments in your essay, because they've just spent the past 15, 20, 30 minutes reading about all those accomplishments in the rest of your application. So keep them there, and here talk about something deeper and more meaningful. Also, I'm just going to say keep the bragging to the minimum. There's nothing worse than somebody like talking about the fantastic Excel model that they built, blah, 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 in this essay. It's okay to say, I started this job and I didn't know how to use Excel, and now I'm creating this model that helped, change this company's future. But you need to put it in the context of your feelings, your emotions, why it mattered so much to you, why you were so proud of what you did, to make it personal and real. And then finally, I'm just going to say avoid fluff is what I call it. And that's, if it's a sentence that anyone can write, don't include it. So a sentence like, attending Stanford GSB will give me the opportunity to develop my business skills and hone my leadership. I'd skip that because anybody can say that. And so now maybe we can just jump to the example and look at some of the things here where this writer could have improved. So the first paragraph is about a universal experience. And I think one thing that is then missing is how that universal experience really applied to the writer. Because there are a lot of people who have grown up in poverty. There are a lot of people who've had parents who've made sacrifices. But not everybody reacts the way that the writer does and says, well, now I want to dedicate myself to bringing joy to others. And the writer needs to explain that journey more clearly. And then the second piece is in the second paragraph. It's great that they talked about what they did, but it would be even richer if they talked a little bit more about what was going on inside them behind these actions. And so instead of just talking about what they did to start this company, were they scared and terrified because this was the first time that they'd ever done something like this? Or had their childhood maybe given them the confidence to tackle something like this because they knew that nothing that they did was going to be harder than what their mother had gone through? And trying to bring that internal voice out in the essay rather than just listing a series of actions can sometimes help strengthen and deepen it. And then finally, I just want to point out this sentence: what matters the most to me is to spend myself joyfully and sacrificially so that others would live fulfilled lives in the hope to find joy like hers. That's a sentence that has some fluff in it, and I think can be really reduced. It's not really clear what joyfully and sacrificially means. And living fulfilled lives and finding joy are kind of redundant. You can cut that down. You can make it something much simpler. You can just say something like, what matters most to me is making sure that others in my life find the same joy that my mother had. And that's going to be a sentence that the reader can understand and identify with a little bit more quickly and more clearly. Scott, what about you? Any thoughts and comments on what the writer could have done or could do here to enhance?
I agree with you completely, Rachel. And I think the part, imagining I'm an AdCom, the 100 online courses part gave me a little pause, and I thought, did you really take 100 online courses? I think it's important to note here that be honest, be direct, and don't feel like you have to come up with some big stat to impress Stanford, because I think they will see through that. They want to see who you are authentically. There's no shame in it having been like 6 online classes, right? The idea is that you learn to code, that you kind of jump into ed tech at first.
And I just want to jump in and say thank you so much for those of you that are commenting on the side. We're going to get to those questions at the end, but we're really glad that you are asking us questions and comments. So please feel free to continue to do that. And don't forget to like us, the video, and subscribe to the channel. So Scott, we're going to flip to you and like to talk a little bit about SAB. Why Stanford? And I'd love to hear from your perspective as a poet and as a coach. What are some of the do's for this process?
Yes, happy to talk through it. And unfortunately, poetry can't really be deployed here since this is a more procedural one, but definitely in what matters to you most. I think for this essay in particular, I'm going to really recommend that you all consider doing some pre-writing with bulleted lists to really get your ideas. Maybe it's an outline format you use. I think it's important to do that before committing the essay to full sentences, because this essay more than the other one is about compiling information, right? It starts with brainstorming your 2 to 4 key aspirations. I think a lot of times folks will focus on one aspiration, which is a missed opportunity. Bonus points here when you're thinking about those aspirations that you want to highlight, if they cross multiple dimensions and they aren't just tied to a particular job. So by dimensions, I mean, maybe you could think about your aspirations as a leader beyond the job you want to get at McKinsey or Bain or a company that's very well known. Maybe you want to deepen your subject matter expertise, and there's a place on the Stanford campus outside the business school where that can happen. And also, it's okay to go a little bigger and think about your aspirations kind of outside of work too, and how those might tie to Stanford. There's a really great book that you all might think about, might actually be helpful as you go through this process in the Stanford essays, called Designing Your Life. That's by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. They teach at Stanford. They teach, there's a life design lab there that where you can kind of think about your life holistically. And I think this essay starts to kind of speak to that. In terms of being Stanford specific, I think that's really important. You want to brainstorm, at least 3 to 4 Stanford specific opportunities that are going to prepare you to achieve those aspirations that you share. And I think bonus points here if you cover different facets of the Stanford experience. And by that, I mean, not just talking about the classes you would want to take, or not just mentioning, the 6 professors that are most exciting to you. A little tip here, I think it's totally fine, and maybe even encouraged to use ChatGPT to help you with research to figure out what's going on the Stanford campus that can support your interests and ideas kind of beyond what's happening at the business school. And I think you'll get bonus points from the committee if you can do some deep dive research and not limit it to, what you might find kind of on the front page of the Stanford GSB site. So maybe use ChatGPT to help you generate lists and ideas, but don't use it to actually write the essay, because then you'll sound like everyone else that uses it. Just a little nod there. I think also it's important to tie those aspirations that you mentioned at the beginning of the essay to Stanford specific opportunities. So make sure there's a one-to-one match there, and you don't want to mention something that Stanford has if it's not directly relevant to the aspiration that you shared. In terms of the mix of the essay, I recommend that my clients spend 25% beginning of the essay kind of talking about those aspirations, and then the rest of the essay kind of really deep diving into Stanford and going beyond the surface. Is there anything, Rachel, that you would add in terms of making this essay, really shine for admissions committees?
Sure. Just one thing that I sometimes notice clients do is they'll spend time describing the course that they're taking. And I just want to remind the readers that the business school admissions committee is very familiar with the courses and what they will teach. Make sure that you tie it to you and what you need to learn. And you can kind of take for granted that they know the subject matter, and you don't need to describe that to them.
Oh, that's great advice. That's great advice, Rachel. Is they know their Stanford reference points. Also, just want to note, Cheryl, thanks for the question in the chat. We'll get to that a little bit later around vulnerability. That'll come up. So I'm glad that you asked that. Keep those questions coming, please. Certainly. So let's look at an example essay for the do's, things that are positive. And this essay here, you don't have the whole essay, but the main idea behind it is that this candidate identifies as a man and wants to use the Stanford experience to create an app that helps with men's mental health, that really kind of jumpstarts men's mental health in particular. And what I liked about this essay in terms of do's is that it's Stanford specific in terms of its examples right up front. It mentions 2 courses at Stanford that the student would want to take to help support this goal of creating this app, Startup Garage and Launchpad. And it also mentions the Stanford Venture Studio as a place where the students' entrepreneurial acumen could be honed. I like that it's more than one-dimensional in its Stanford references right away. So we get courses and the Venture Studio, and not just every kind of entrepreneurship course within kind of GSB's kind of second-year elective set, which is nice. And I also like that the desire that's mentioned, kind of this, the candidate says at the core of my ambitions is this desire to alleviate burdens of anxiety and depression. That's tangibly linked to the Stanford specific examples, right? So I think this is kind of a good start at starting to connect the dots between the kind of the ambition that the potential applicant has, and then the reality on the ground at Stanford that can help them get there.
And I just want to, as a moderator, want to jump in here. I think that varying the dimensions of how you express your interest is really, really important, right? So don't just go ahead and list this class, this class, this class. Like, do you want to do research with a faculty member? What missions do you want to be a part of? What is it about the ethos of the university, right? Are you going to be learning from other people that you're in with? You mentioned that like-minded individuals, right? So I find as somebody that's been at admissions for a long time that if you're just like laundry list of this class, this class, this class, it seems like that's the only way that you're learning. And we know that people learn in a lot of different ways. So I would definitely encourage you, as Scott has said, to be more than one-dimensional in those examples.
That's great advice, Judith. Thank you for chiming in there. And Rachel, anything else that you would note right away?
I thought he did a good job of showing the reason why he had this career vision and the passion for it. And then also it was a very clear what he wanted to do and with his goal, which is helpful. It was not vague at all.
Great. Yes. Very clear goal. You come away from it knowing exactly that's what the student would want to do. Great. So thinking about the don'ts, I think it's important to kind of write in your own voice. And this goes back to that ChatGPT example. I'm sure some of you are wanting to lean on that, but it's important to kind of on paper be the person you would be in the interview if you're invited to interview, right? You want those to match up. And you're going to probably talk to your friends and family a lot about this essay because it's Stanford. And it's important to stay authentic to yourself through that process and not let people kind of change your language and your approach, right? So trusting your instincts there. Because you want that one-to-one match with Stanford to be real and that to be verified in the interview if you make it to that stage. Vulnerability, Cheryl mentioned and kind of asked about that value in essays. I think that vulnerability is memorable, and because of that, it's more than fine to be a little vulnerable in this essay as well, and maybe share a weakness you have that Stanford experience can help you with, right? You're all probably going to be okay at public speaking because you're business school students, but maybe you're hesitant to kind of get up and present on a new idea or a project at work. That's something you're struggling with. And at Stanford, you're going to have some opportunities to kind of get up in front of others and kind of conquer that fear, right? It's okay to kind of make vulnerability part of the equation there. I think it's also important to note you don't want to limit your aspirations here in this essay to just your next job. And I think a lot of times we get tunnel vision on that shiny object that we're going to get to right after business school, but try to think about your next 5 to 10 jobs, your life outside work more broadly. Again, I think that book, Designing Your Life, Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, is a great place to start with that. They talk about a concept called ikigai, I-K-I-G-A-I, which is a Japanese term. It's kind of your reason for being. And I think if you can kind of start from that place as you think about aspirations, that'll be helpful. It's important, again, to not focus on a single dimension of Stanford too much. And Judith hit on this, right? Not just listing classes you want to take, but really diving more deeply. And maybe there's a research project, a specific one that you'd want to engage with a professor who's already doing that research, right? It's going to take a little bit more effort to get there in terms of figuring out who that professor is, but that effort is going to be rewarded in terms of the committee feeling like you've really done your homework. And then, don't hesitate to be super granular, right? That goes with what I just said. So, that deep diving, thoughtful Stanford specific research will be noted. So if you did want to start a company, for example, like this gentleman does, an app that is kind of focused around mental health, maybe you could do a little research project on LinkedIn and try to figure out how many Stanford GSB grads have actually done the same thing. Like, where do they live? Where are they based? How could you connect with them during the program? Kind of putting some color and shape to that goal in terms of that network you'd want to build would be really helpful. Rachel, anything you would add in the terms of the don'ts for this essay?
No, I mean, I think you've really covered a lot of them. It's just important to have a clear argument. One thing I would say is, particularly if your career vision is a little bit distinctive, maybe you want to start your own company, or you have an idea for how a particular industry should be changed, make sure that the business logic holds up, because this is business school and you should be able to kick the tires and fix any of the mistakes. Treat it like a business school case and know that it will hold up to a grilling.
Right. And that's really important, right? That's why you want it to be so authentic to who you are, because there's you're going to be asked about this either in an interview, in a conversation, you never know. Don't say it unless you mean it and you own it. I think that, to me, is the most important part of this process, is really diving in and believing in what you're talking about and knowing that it's authentic and true.
And also having the opportunity to show expertise and knowledge that is real and is deep and is not just superficial.
Yes, those are wonderful additions to the advice here. In terms of this is essays don'ts, I think in terms of aspiration, right, we only get one. We get one sentence about the aspirations of the candidate. They even say at the core of my ambitions, but they only talk about one, right, this desire. And so I think there's a missed opportunity to talk about kind of the multiple ambitions at play here, the multiple aspirations, and how they might connect to each other. There's also, in terms of that kicking the can idea that Rachel mentioned and treating this like a case, there's a value claim that's made in the first sentence, right? The burdens of anxiety and depression that disproportionately affect men. I spent 5 seconds Googling this, and Mayo Clinic tells me that twice as many women as men experience depression. And so right away, I'm thinking, especially if I'm a woman reading this, has this person done research on this topic or this idea, or is it just coming from a place of kind of personal interest? So I think it's important to think about your audience, to make sure that you're connecting with other people, that you're not excluding folks as you're kind of framing your aspirations there. And I think too, the Stanford specific examples that the candidate uses, this is actually the first paragraph of the essay. And I think those are kind of better explored more deeply later in the essay, right? So there's not a need to dive in right away with Stanford specific examples. It's probably going to be a better strategy to actually spend a little bit more time talking about the aspirations more broadly than that core of the aspiration, right? And I think that we don't get to know this candidate as well as we could have if they'd spent a couple more sentences talking about aspirations specifically, and then talked about Stanford specific examples later in the essay. Rachel, anything you would add to this?
Yeah. So this is just kind of in keeping with our discussion earlier about that accuracy and honesty. Your point about the statement that anxiety and depression disproportionately affect men, probably what the writer intended to say was that men disproportionately do not have an outlet for dealing with these situations. But that's an example where that accuracy and nuance can completely derail an entirely well-meaning sentence. But because you didn't nail exactly what you meant, it doesn't work.
And be careful in this case. I mean, this is a pretty big blanket statement. So I agree with Rachel. We're not deliberating is this true? It's more choose your words and be really clear on what you mean. Because even I look at the sentence and I would have added something to the end, disproportionately affect men or they don't manage it, right? Or they don't address it, or lots of different ways to kind of finish that sentence. So it's an admirable aspect, but again, I agree with you guys. It's not particularly well laid out.
Great. Well, that actually concludes our kind of open discussion about those two. So we have a little bit of time for questions, Judith, it looks like.
Fabulous. Okay, so I'm going to just take it from the top. We've been asked, is it okay to emphasize global events and challenges that are relevant to our experience in global business, such as the pandemic, wars, macroeconomic collapse, and disaster? And kind of, I've got, I think from what I understand from you, Tieto, you have 400 words talking about this, and you don't have as much talking about your personal experience. So for Rachel and for Scott, how would you kind of balance these very general ideas of like what's going on in the world versus, you know, how you're sort of talking about yourself in the world?
I mean, I would say one thing to do is keep in mind that everybody understands the experience of the pandemic. You don't need to explain that, but what you did during the pandemic and how you responded, that's where your story comes in.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And I think it's all about, we've talked a lot about, it's important to not just talk about kind of the big kind of general idea of the pandemic or the war in Ukraine or whatever that is, but to really be personal in how it specifically affected you. And I don't think you need to spend any time, to Rachel's point, explaining that. But I would say too, that I would kind of take a step back, and before that becomes part of your essay, make sure that it's really closely tied to what matters most to you. It may not be, right? It may be that the pandemic kind of fell on, you know, kind of happened to you separate from the thing that matters most. So don't feel like you need to like write towards a certain thing. If you're Ukrainian, for example, you don't have to write about the war in Ukraine, right? You could, but you don't have to. So don't feel shackled by kind of these macro events either.
Cheryl, I'm going to look to your great question. Anything that Stanford reapplicants should keep in mind. We know we have a lot of reapplicants out there, and I love reapplicants because they've really been through it. It's no longer, I've got all these things that I have to squish into my application essays. It's you sort of have already some feedback about how you presented the first time around. And so I do find that reapplication process, it's also not brand new to you, right? You've kind of gone through this. So Scott, Rachel, things that you might recommend or to keep in mind for a reapplicant for Stanford?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that they may read your essays from before, they may not. So you have to walk that fine balance of writing an essay that stands completely on its own and an application that stands on its own. And it's okay to change pieces of it and change your career vision because obviously you've grown, but you can't flat out contradict what you've written before. Mm-hmm. I think that's the hardest part for reapplicants is just making sure that they can have both of those.
And it's okay to change your mind, right? You might have started out like in one direction, and this year you're like, oh, I thought about it, and I am now looking at it differently. But you know, a word like upon reflection after my deny last year, I've had an opportunity to really examine where I see myself heading, right? So just like one short transitional comment can really help you without the whole story. You know, you could just sort of say, look, I thought about it more. This is where I am. Scott, you're nodding. I don't know if you have some other tricks to the trade for that one.
I just think introspection is really important, right? And introspection will get their attention more than, dear committee, I had a 720, now I have a 740, right? Like there needs to be some other growth. Obviously, some other things happen in your career besides like your stats kind of being tweaked. But it's also about coming back to that. Like think of it like a business negotiation. You wouldn't go back to a potential client with the same offer, right? So really thinking about what is different. And being vulnerable and honest about that, as opposed to trying to kind of keep it to, well, my numbers are better or something that's really kind of linear. I think you're going to have to win them over in terms of your story. Mm-hmm. I think that, yeah.
So Ian, you ask a great question. If I have a friend who went to GSB and in the Why Stanford essay, should I talk about it? Is it a good idea to talk about that conversation? A terrific question, one that we see a lot. Rachel, how do you feel about name dropping in essays?
Don't do it just to impress the admissions committee with the fact that you know somebody at Stanford, because that is absolutely not going to impress them. It's only if it really matters to what you're trying to say and your message. Otherwise, it's not important. Just use it as your background is usually the advice that I give.
So part of the conversation. Scott, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would just say that if you know someone there, great. You should maybe ask them for e-intros to people that you don't know. Mm-hmm. And then maybe you could talk about, you know, what that process was like of getting to know other people and how that kind of shows you what the class is like. Having that access point of someone that will introduce you for info chats is really valuable. Maybe not to be mentioned in the essay, but in terms of learning more about on the ground Stanford and what it's like. So.
Great. So we are just about out of time. I know that we have a couple of additional comments and questions. We're really happy to answer them. So certainly, please feel free to reach out to us at fortunaadmissions.com. We all do sessions, half-hour free consults to help you kind of figure out what to do next. You can see Fortuna Expert Coaches. There's our website, and we're really happy to talk with anybody about questions you have, how to convert that interview invitation into an actual admit. And again, our web address is listed underneath. And we do this all day, every day. Scott and I are always on the phone. So we're really looking forward to speaking with you. Don't forget to like this when you see it on YouTube or Facebook. We love doing this, and we know that our friends really appreciate at GMAT Club getting the word out. And so if you found this session helpful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Again, for Fortuna Admissions, Judith Hodara, thank you so much to Rachel Erickson and Scott Brownlee for a fabulous discussion. I've really enjoyed working with you both, and we look forward to seeing everybody soon. Good luck with your applications this fall. Thank you.